Hello everyone, this is Evan Slead from EGM Now, and I'm here to talk to you today about the remake of Secret of Mana. And I got to go to a gameplay playthrough event with Square Enix and get to play the game for a little while and talk to some of the team about what was planned for the game, and we're going to look at the footage right now. So what you're seeing actually is not the beginning of the game. It's just a little bit into the story. I think it's about an hour into the story, they said. But the nice thing is that you can start to see just how the fighting mechanics are going to be in this game. Pretty similar to the original from what I understand and from what I could see when I played. But there's a couple things that are kind of interesting that are different, but first and foremost, just before we get into anything, you do start with two characters. Right here we have our hero character and the princess ally, and she's gray. As you can kind of tell, her color palette is gray, and that's because she died. That was not by my doing, that was by the team. They just kind of had me start out this way when I did the playthrough. But we will heal her, and we can see her in action once she gets the cold remedy and everything. So right now I'm just kind of getting out of this area and fighting some of these enemies. But, you know, from what I saw, the enemy variation is, kind of small, at least in this area. You have these flying kind of bees, and then attacking flower plants, and then these little tiny yellow kind of like bunnies, I think they are. But if you look right now, so we just kind of have a simple menu. So on the top right of the screen, we have our mini-map, and then on the main part of the screen, we have the two avatars for the characters with their HP and MP amounts. And then if you look below the main character's HP bar, there is that yellow box that has a percentage that continues to climb as I attack. And the reason for that is that when I make an attack, it does full force. So if you see, I'll do an attack, it'll do about 22 damage. Like right here on this mushroom. When I go back up to attack it, it should have enough damage on it to get about 20 or 22 to pop out. But when I attack in succession, the thing that happens is that if I don't do it without waiting, then the damage output is a little bit worse. So when I do these attacks, the best thing to do is to attack and then step back, and then go back in again once the percentage has been filled up, because you do a little bit more damage that way. The nice thing is that if you do try to string on combos, they don't do as much damage, but they do kind of stun the enemy. So you're able to, get in some nice blows if you just need to get a little bit of extra damage on them. But I've noticed that my best strategy was to attack, let the bar fill back up, and then go back, like I'm doing with this mushroom right here. And then, some of them have high health, like these guys I think have around 60 health, so it'll take you a long time if you stood there and just kept whacking without waiting for the percentage to get filled back up again. So yeah, it's an interesting system, and it definitely adds a little bit of strategy to the gameplay. I would say the most noticeable thing that I had from the beginning was that it is pretty repetitive, but I mean, I remember feeling that way with the original game too. I didn't think they would do too much to change up the gameplay or make it feel completely different, but for here, it works, and it's doable. It's fun. Thankfully, there are a lot more landscapes to work with in the game, and there are boss fights and variations on enemies. So while this looks like a lot of the same from the start, it does thankfully begin to change up as the game progresses. But I'm actually about to get into a town just to show you guys a little bit of what it looks like when you're trying to buy items or interact with NPCs. But as you can see here, the nice thing is that with my hero character, your sword is just a rusty sword, so it's not even that powerful. He's able to do wide breadth of attacks, so he doesn't just have to focus on one enemy at a time. He can take out multiples at a time, which is really helpful, especially with this new, the system that is making it so you have to kind of back up and then come back and attack again. And as you saw just a minute ago, I did get a chest that was dropped from enemies, and those hold just different healing items like candy, and sometimes it'll have the miracle dust item that basically heals and revives a character. And here I'm just trying to get through a couple more of these enemies before I go into the town. But overall, I would say this opening portion, I had a good time with it, but I definitely felt like I could get the gist of the game pretty quickly, which isn't a bad thing, but it definitely felt like I was just kind of searching for, you know, a little bit more out of the gameplay, a little bit more strategy, which I think could have been added. And maybe that will down the road. This is an early build, so this is not the official end build of the game that means that everything's done. But as you can see here, you can go into the towns and you can interact with different NPCs by going into buildings. Very, you know, Zelda-esque in the way that you can play. And there's, you know, real-time voice acting, which is really cool. And there's different layers to buildings, too. So you'll see, like, just this house, you know, has 2 floors. And, you know, obviously you can go through and look and talk to different characters, which is helpful. But there's other places, like there's castles, and they have dungeons and areas that require you to visit several times. And they kind of act like labyrinths, which is... it's a nice exploration change up, just so you have more to look at and more to do. But here also is an inn, and this is where you can easily heal both characters completely, and that's just by paying 10 gold and going to sleep. And the nice thing for that is that it is better than having to buy a bunch of items and make sure to keep them constantly revived and healed. And you get gold pretty easily in the game, from what I've seen so far, so making sure that you're up to date on everything is not that difficult. I did not go to sleep just because I wanted to explore a little bit more. This character, when I was talking to him, the way that they gave me the game to play it, they started me, like I said, farther into the storyline, so I wasn't exactly sure which direction I should have been going, but eventually, as you see here, I jumped to another part of the game. I realized that I was going the wrong direction and back toward the beginning of the game, which I should not have been doing. But yeah, so, and as you saw just now, Prism, my ally character, she gained a level. And that's just like any RPG here. We have levels that you can grow into and boost your stats. But as you can see, now that she's revived, while I'm not controlling her, she does follow my character. And when I'm attacking, she does join in and attack the enemy as well. So that's actually another great way to get a lot of damage out without worrying about having to keep doing the back and forth run and backs. Because right there, I did a good amount of damage, but then she also added on a big chunk as well. So it's a pretty good system to have 2 players. Another thing you can do actually too is this canon character. You can pay 50 gold and you can travel to different areas you've been to, mostly towns. But the reason that's helpful is because these maps are actually pretty big, which is good for exploring. But there are moments where you just want to get back. Either you want to heal both characters, or you need to buy an item you need, or at least just get back to a central hub to know where to go. And the great thing about this is that it's an easy way to just move around. And again, 50 gold is not that much. So it's not like you're making some big sacrifice by paying that much to do it. But yeah, so I actually went back to a town just so I could go back and see if I could figure out which direction would be best to go. One thing that's kind of funny is, as you noticed just there, is that a lot of the time when I do certain interactions, the ally character will basically step on top of my hero character's avatar, and they kind of just like meld into one, which is a little messy looking. And I think that's just to streamline the movements of the characters, but it doesn't really work out that well. But I was hearing other townspeople talk to me about going to this village that was below the main town, and that's where I am right now. But unfortunately, this is an area that you unlock a little bit later in the game, because when you first visit here, none of the characters will talk to you, and they do warn you of that. The townspeople say that if you go to this area, they won't speak to you. Thankfully, nothing negative affects you. It just basically means you can't actually do anything in this area. So I tried talking and then realized I should just go back. So I am back in the main exploration part of the area because I wanted to try out this alternate dimension that they have been talking about. So if you find these different stones, you get transported to this alternate dimension, as you'll see right here. And there's new enemies, and it's a little bit of a varied look. Kind of like, you know, I know this is definitely from the original Secret of Mana, but people will also recognize something like this from something like, you know, The Legend of Zelda, where you can sometimes traverse to a different area completely out of time and out of the same dimension. But just healing up some characters, because these bow and arrow enemies are actually kind of difficult just because they have the range attacks and they do a pretty good amount of damage. But yeah, up here you can also do some exploring and look for some new items. And one thing that was a little tricky for me was seeing those thorns. I thought that if I touched them I would get hurt, but they're actually just blockades, just, you know, that look like they would actually hurt you. So it took me a little while to figure that out, but once I did, I was not as afraid to step closer and attack the enemies when they were closer to those little barriers. But yeah, right here I'm just trying to make sure I keep both characters healed up with candy, and it's pretty helpful and pretty easy to do it. But yeah, we just go through here and get some of these enemies defeated. That character up on the top right with the bag is actually an NPC that you can buy items from, which is also really helpful when you're trying to get through these areas that are definitely disconnected from the rest of the map, because going in and out of these areas, it takes a little bit of time and you can't just freely do it without having to do a lot of backtracking or going out of your way. So it's nice to have these NPCs that you can buy things from, so you don't always have to worry about flying back and using the inn to heal up, because as you can see, Prism, she's already dead again, and that's just because, again, these bow and arrow range attackers are pretty good at taking out my ally. But the nice thing is you can buy items, you can also buy equipment, and I'm going to show you a little bit here. You can equip different kinds of gear for both characters: a head, a torso, and an arm piece. And so for here, I already had some items. Most of them are for my ally character, but I do have a little bandana that my character wears. And then for her, I actually got a new bow that, as you can see, upped her defense, evade, and magic defense stats. And then if you look below those stats on the bottom left-hand side, we actually have the different kinds of elemental effects that can happen to characters. And those ones you can get, you know, more defense from, and you can also make sure null when they use them against you. We'll see later in the cave world there is the balloon effect, and that's where we are right here, the cave world. This is the main dungeon that I got to play, where we get our first boss fight, or at least my first boss fight, which we'll see at the end of this video. But here is just a little bit more exploration. It feels like a combination of that alternate dimension and the open world, because you have a lot more enemies in here than you do in those alternate dimensions, but there's a little bit more focus on puzzle solving and exploration through opening up new areas, and not just an open world environment like the rest of the game seems to have. But in here, I found a pretty useful item that I didn't get to use, but basically it's just it's a escape item that helps you get out of these kind of dark, deep dungeons that are not easy to navigate. Yeah, so right there, the magic rope. But the main new enemy for this area are these goblins that actually have a lot of health. But thankfully, I got a spear, so I was able to do a lot more attacks from a distance. It's not as useful as a bow and arrow is, but it definitely helps for enemies like those slimes that you don't want to get too close. And of course, we have more mushrooms, and we have enemies that we've seen throughout the game so far, but they're just combined. And then these bats, the spear is also very helpful for them, because sometimes you can miss them using your sword just because they're aerial attackers, but the spear is a great way to do that. As you can see, my ally character has kind of like brass knuckles, basically, where she can just run up and whop them with a punch or a kick. But the cool thing about these slimes, speaking of enemies here, is that they can actually regenerate. So if you're not fast enough and if you can't get enough hits in, they definitely will just keep respawning, and you can find yourself in some pretty tricky situations. This is the deepest part of the dungeon, and here you'll see that there's no way up onto that ledge, but if I go up, there's a little bit of a trick here where you can defeat this enemy, and on that wall above him there was a little lever, and after you hit that, it, as you saw, drops that middle section down, and you're able to have a little bit more platforming and a little bit more exploration options. And then the music changes, I think, just because we're going into the I guess they're gnomes? I'm not... Or dwarves, I'm sorry. They're dwarves. The dwarf village. And you can go in here, and it's actually its own little town that is connected to this dungeon. So you can buy items. There is an inn here, so you can heal up. And there is also a blacksmith. And the blacksmith is actually a pivotal character that you can purchase items from. One item that I do need is the axe, and the axe is going to help me get through certain rocks that I can't break through currently. You do get the axe by performing and completing certain objectives, but first you have to do a boss fight. So the way to do the boss fight is you have to go up into this little show area where they actually have characters putting on a show, and all you have to do with them is interact with them. You go through a little video. Unfortunately, I can't show you that in this video, but there is a little bit of a twist there of how you get your next ally character. But first, we have to defeat this enemy that is protected behind these rocks I was talking about that you need the axe to break through. So what you have to rely on is your sword or your long-range spear weapon to get attacks on the Tropicalo. And it kind of pops up in different areas, and then it has these vines that grow out. And what you have to do is make sure you don't get grabbed by them, but you're also delivering damage, because if you don't, they'll just continue to pop up, and they'll eventually will grab you, and they'll do a good amount of damage. But then, of course, the Tropicalo also has projectiles that it throws at you, just like any good boss. But not too bad. It was a fun boss fight, and I was able to get through it pretty quickly. But here you get a new item, and then, like I said, you get the materials you needed to make the axe to get through the game. But that's the first look at the remake of Secret of Mana. There's more to come. The video game is not completely done yet, so there's a lot more of a build. But make sure to check back with EGM Now for more information as the game unfolds in the future.